Aloha, this is Professor Wendy Kuntz from Kapi'olani Community College. Let's do a review of Chapter 2 from Biology, the Core, on the chemistry of life. So when we think about living things, what makes up a living thing? What makes up the matter of a living thing? And basically, we can think about what you're made of, what is other living things like trees made of, and what are non-living things like your desk or your laptop or the universe made of. Every object in the universe is composed of matter, and we can define matter as anything that occupies space and has mass. Matter is found in three physical states: gas, liquid, or solid. Chemistry is the field of science that studies matter. And to study biology, we need to know some basic chemistry in order to understand many biological processes. Atoms are the smallest unit that retains all of the properties of their type of matter. So for example, a hydrogen atom is the smallest unit that we can have of hydrogen. Atoms can bond together to form molecules. For example, we can have two atoms of oxygen form together to form an O2 molecule. All matter is composed of individual elements, and an element is a basic substance that can't be broken down. So that's that atom idea. The smallest amount of any element is an atom, and these individual elements come together to form compounds. Table salt is an example of a compound, which is also a molecule. So it's two atoms coming together, and it's a compound because it has two different types of atoms. So salt is NaCl, which is one atom of sodium and one atom of chlorine. Matter can't be created or destroyed, but individual atoms can be rearranged into different molecules or compounds. So for example, we can have reactants that get transformed through some type of chemical reaction. So when you eat food, you take glucose and combine it with oxygen gas, and a byproduct of that is the energy we use to run our lives. And then we also have byproducts of water and carbon dioxide. In chemistry, we write reactions with the reactants on the left and the products on the right. So how do we organize matter? You may have seen something called a periodic table of elements. And the periodic table lists all of the chemical elements ordered by their atomic number. All matter consists of chemical elements, so we have here carbon, and this atomic number is the corresponding number of protons. For biology, I want you to think about the four elements that make up the bulk of living cells. These include oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. There are also 7 other elements that are used or needed by the living body, but in tiny amounts. As we think about life on Earth, we can go up in complexity from a very tiny atom to combining to molecules, all the way up to the biodiversity that we see among plants and animals and their interactions with non-living things at the level of ecosystems. So let's go down to the atom, that smallest unit of an element. And I want you to just kind of have a general idea that there are protons and neutrons that make up atoms. For biology class, I really want you to focus more on how an atom moves in and out of different molecules, especially through the processes that living things. When atoms come together, they are held by what we call chemical bonds. And there are two major categories of chemical bonds. We call these, one is ionic bonds, where there's actually a transfer of one or more electrons. And then there is covalent bonds, which involve the sharing of one or more electrons. These will play a role if you get deeper into the chemistry of living things, but they're also helpful for us when we start thinking about one of the most important molecules for life, which is water. So water contains polar covalent bonds, and this is important because it shapes some of the properties of water. And water molecules themselves are held together by hydrogen bonds, which is fairly weak, but it allows water to have this very unique structure. So water is so suitable for living things because it has within its molecule covalent bonds, and then between water molecules, they are held together by hydrogen bonds. These hydrogen bonds constantly break and reform, which gives water kind of its flexibility. And so we can think of water having these important properties when it's at different stages. We have frozen water, which actually floats. It also means that water is an effective solvent, and it's great for temperature regulation, and water molecules stick together due to these hydrogen bonds. As water freezes, there's actually more space between the bonds, and that means that a chunk of ice has fewer water molecules, which means that it's lighter, and so ice actually floats. If ice didn't float, we would have very different ecosystems. But because ice floats, we have all of these polar ecosystems, for example, that wouldn't exist if water froze solid. It also means that water is a very effective solvent. So many other molecules will dissolve in water. It also means that water absorbs and releases heat. So at a biosphere level, this is really important because our Earth is over 70% water, and water is therefore driving much of our climate system. Living things all require water, and they use water for different reactions. They also can use water to regulate temperature. Because of this property of water to absorb and release heat. So for example, when you sweat, you are using this property through evaporative cooling to regulate your temperature. This polar nature of water also means that there is surface tension on the top of liquid water. So there's actually organisms that have adapted to do, for example, like this water wolf spider or water striders, to actually walk basically on the surface of liquid water. So most of the chemical reactions for living things occur in water because water is highly soluble. Most compounds and molecules are highly soluble in water. One of the things that can be measured when we dissolve compounds in water is the resulting pH level, or this measure of acidity. So pH scale runs from acidic, which is at the 0 range, and to basic. Each one of these numbers, each one of these pH levels actually is a tenfold change in the number of dissolved hydrogen ions. So an acid is a chemical that's, when dissolved in water, releases lots of hydrogen ions. And so when we have very acidic conditions, there's lots of hydrogen ions. So we can think of lemons or even strawberries or tomatoes as being having low pH and being acidic. On the other side of the scale, when a base is a chemical that, once dissolved in water, actually tends to will remove hydrogen ions. And so some of our most kind of chemicals that are destructive to living tissues, things like bleach and ammonia and lye, are on this basic side. Buffers is what your body uses and living cells use to regulate these or minimize the impacts of changes of pH. At the ecosystem level, we are concerned about changing pH through things such as adding carbon dioxide. And adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere actually increases the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in water, which makes the water more acidic. And many organisms have evolved or adapted to the current pH levels. And as things become more acidic, we see things like bleaching of corals. Another important component that's related to chemistry and living things is that, in addition to water, most of our matter that we are made up of is carbon. So after water, we are basically carbon-based living things. Carbon has some special properties because a carbon atom can form 4 bonds, and so it basically forms a scaffold for making many different types of molecules. So all 3 of these shown are different carbon-based molecules, and they have different structures, basically different skeletons, and that means they can interact in different ways in your living cells. And in addition to the skeleton, carbon atoms can add or carbon molecules rather, can add a functional group, and that can greatly change the way a molecule interacts with other molecules. When we think about carbon molecules in the body, there are 4 classes of what we call organic molecules or carbon-based molecules that are important to life. These include carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So how do we get all of this matter into our bodies to form new molecules? We do this by ingesting food. And so we call these, when we get these molecules like food, we call these polymers or macromolecules because they're many smaller molecules joined together. And so what your body is doing is this process we call hydrolysis, where a macromolecule or a big polymer is broken down into smaller components or monomers. So for example, a protein that you ingest, if you're eating a hamburger, for example, will then go through your process of digestion and now be broken down into monomers or amino acids that can enter the bloodstream and be taken to cells. On the other side, your body and cells are taking these monomers and putting them together to form new molecules. We call this dehydration synthesis. Basically, what's happening is those monomers now that you have in your bloodstream are now put together to form new proteins. Another major component that we said of molecules is carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are a common source of energy for building blocks of other molecules. We can think of the simplest carbohydrates as sugars, the simple sugars. These include sucrose, glucose, fructose. They all have a similar structure with slightly different arrangements. When we get multiple sugars together, we call this a disaccharide. And when we have more than 2, we call it a polysaccharide. So molecules like starch and cellulose are actually made up of many little glucose monomers or glucose molecules put together in long chains. Animals will also put together polysaccharides like glycogen and chitin from glucose monomers. The next major group is the fats, the lipids. These perform essential functions, including energy storage, cushioning, insulation, membrane functioning, and hormone regulation. An important property of lipids is that they are hydrophobic. They do not mix well with water. You can think of mixing oil and vinegar. The oil will float on top of the vinegar. This is really important because this property allows for the formation of cell membranes. And so each cell membrane is made up of lipids, a special type of lipid called a phospholipid. And this bilayer of phospholipids basically forms this membrane around the cells and allows things to happen inside the cell separate from outside the cell. Another important lipid is cholesterol, which maintains fluidity in most animal cell membranes. And if you have high cholesterol, one of the concerns is that you may have too much of the bad cholesterol, and this can cause hardening in certain tissues, especially in your arteries. Much of the fat that we eat contains triglycerides, and these are often stored for future use in our fat or adipose tissue. Another important type of lipid that has many roles and functions in your body is steroids. So steroids are actually a lipid molecule. And so our estrogen and testosterone are types of steroid lipids. And as you've probably heard before, males and female characteristics are built in your cells in response to the amount of testosterone or the amount of estrogen present. Unfortunately, we also have man-made steroids that can enhance performance, and when people take these, they often have dangerous side effects. So living things are dependent on the chemistry for the functioning of their cells and their larger body tissues, right? And your diet helps determine what types of molecules are available to your tissues. One distinction that we often talk about is whether you're having saturated fats or unsaturated fats. So saturated fat molecules have these straight chain tails, where an unsaturated fat has these double bonds in here, and these are liquid at room temperature. These react differently in your body, and the recommendation is to focus more on unsaturated fats. And these are healthier and tend to be found in higher amounts in plant products. Sometimes through chemistry technology, we can take an unsaturated fat and add more bonds. And this was done for a number of years, and we had these, they were called trans fats. As of 2018, however, these are now no longer allowed for use in hydrogenated oils because they were found to be quite unhealthy. So we all need fat. Sometimes we tend to think of fat as a bad thing, but we need fats as part of our well-balanced diet. So when you're eating food for lunch, you are using different types of organic molecules, primarily carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And as we were saying, proteins are an important part of your diet, and they play important roles in your body. Proteins are those polymers that come together to form from monomers to form a protein. So we take amino acids and put them together to form proteins. A polypeptide is a chain of amino acids. In your body, proteins perform a huge variety of tasks. Protein function is determined by precise amino acid sequence and shape. So just a small change in the instructions for making a protein, for example, for making hemoglobin in blood cells, can result in a disease called sickle cell anemia. Inside your body, you have special molecules that can help speed up reactions, and these are called enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that help lower what's known as the activation energy of a chemical reaction so that they can occur with less energy. Each enzyme has a specific function, and so it targets just a single type of molecule. We call that its substrate. Your body also has inhibitors that sometimes prevent enzymes from working, and so the inhibitors can keep a reaction from happening. Enzyme function really depends on shape, and changes in shape can really mess up an enzyme and keep it from working. Gene mutations can lead to a dysfunction in an enzyme, so can things like heat or toxins. Understanding a little bit of the basic chemistry of life will help you understand how cells function, which is what Chapter 3 of the core will take a deep dive into.